taking into the consideration that Jones offered himself to fight at heavyweight, why would the UFC go with a fight that isn't really interesting like OSP when there are so many interesting matches at heavyweight? It's a great question, particularly in an era when Conor McGregor is having nonsensical rematches. Not saying it's a bad rematch, not saying that, again, we talked about this before, not saying UFC 200 is bad. It's a little weird. And why are they fighting him and Nate Diaz at welterweight? A lot of it just doesn't really make any sense. But I actually took calls on this. Pardon me. I took calls on this on my radio show, and the basic question was, what are you more interested in? Jones versus OSP for an interim title, or Jones versus, say, Mark Hunt? And, look, this is not highly scientific. It's only anecdotal by definition, but it was to a man, Mark Hunt. There just seemed to be a lot more interest in Mark Hunt. Mark Hunt is certainly no less popular. His Q rating is certainly no lower than OSP's. At a minimum, they're equal, likely higher. And the idea of Jones jumping to heavyweight, the idea of him fighting as such a tremendous power puncher coming off of a good win, that to me seems deeply intriguing. Why would they go with a notably less interesting fight? It's only speculation at this point. But the most explanatory theory that I can think of is that whatever you make of the Conor McGregor case, it's aberrant in more ways than one, which is to say, my guess is they just didn't want Jon abandoning the light heavyweight track for heavyweight. Assuming he goes in there and he beats Mark Hunt. Let's say he beats him badly. Not saying that necessarily would happen, but let's just posit a scenario where that takes place. Now you have, look, of course they could make the Cormier rematch after that, but I think what a lot of people will be clamoring for would be for Jones to, is there really a point at going back to light heavyweight at this point? I mean, he's already just trucking top heavyweight contenders. Let's see what he can do up there. In other words, it would be this abandonment of something that before all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted at light heavyweight. Giving him that interim belt makes it more attractive to stay at light heavyweight, right? There's a certain amount of authenticity that you and I may question about that interim belt, but probably in Jon's mind, that's all he really needs to, lure him back to that kind of place. So that's the only real reason I can think of, is that they're willing to accommodate these weird these weird weight fights, these catch weights in the case of Cyborg, or McGregor not just fighting out of his weight class, but in doing so in a very unusual way, right? They're willing to make some room for that, but I think they're also, look, what is the dominant model of UFC matchmaking? It is rigid, not in a bad way, but rigid, clear, unequivocal weight divisions with a hierarchy, someone at the top, and a queue of contenders. And of course, it all gets messed around, and Gustafsson gets title shots after being knocked out, and look, it's not exactly as linear as they often try to make it seem, but it is mostly pretty linear. And I think that they're trying to preserve that before Jon makes his eventual leap. But I certainly feel like you can tell right away, OSP versus Mark Hunt, in terms of one or the other being Jon Jones' opponent, seemed to me the interest was pretty clearly on the side of Mark Hunt. So the inevitability of Jones going up there, assuming he gets past OSP and assuming he gets past Cormier, and whether or not he fights Gustafsson again or Rumble, we'll see what all that happens. But there is a lot of gold at heavyweight for him, both figuratively and literally, in the form of a heavyweight championship belt, if Jones chooses to pursue that route. It's the same question about interim titles generally, right? This is a question I've been pondering. How many interim titles do you think the UFC would allow to exist in circulation at one time? Right? My guess is at the most 2, but I don't know if that's true. Maybe it's 3, right? Maybe it's 1, or whatever the case may be. But I think what they were at was a saturation point where it's like, let's give one to Jon. Let's make it clear that light heavyweight is a priority for him, so we can get that Cormier rematch. It's big business, right? Let's make sure he stays on that path. And maybe he wanted to stay on that path too. Maybe it was just more interesting for him personally that there was unfinished business for him at that weight class, right? But it's just the idea of you can do some of these aberrant things. You can make a couple of interim titles. You can make a couple of, crazy fights outside of weight classes. But generally speaking, what is your bread and butter? What is it that you do well? What is it that your product is predicated on? It is predicated on the championships meaning something. It is predicated on them being challenged for on a routine basis. It is predicated on a weight class and a division full of men and women who are vying for that top spot. They will make accommodations, it seems, when it's in everyone's interest. But there are long-term strategic interests at play with Jones that, to me, make it seem like sticking with light heavyweight, picking up where he left off in the short run is better, and then they'll get to the heavyweight stuff in the long run.